Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez. On this program, I've mentioned plenty of times before how I'm finishing my master's in Christian apologetics at Liberty University. And my master's thesis that I'm working on completing, it's about 100 pages or so, is on the issue of abortion. Specifically, what is the unborn and what does it mean to be a human being? The two questions that I think are central to the abortion debate. And I cited a whole bunch of works throughout the paper, a whole bunch of books, but one of, if not the most cited resource throughout the whole paper is a book called Defending Life, written by Dr. Francis Beckwith, who I have the honor of speaking with today. Dr. Beckwith, thank you so much for jumping on today.
It's great to be here, Jacob. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you for your kind comments.
Oh, of course. I mean, this book has really changed my life for the better and just equipped me with an immense amount of resources for this paper. So I'm hopeful that we could share some of that with our listeners today. But just in case anybody isn't familiar with you and your work, I'm sure most are, but I would like to just read off your accolades because they are really truly amazing. So you're a professor of philosophy and church and state studies at Baylor University. You serve as associate director of graduate studies in philosophy, an affiliate professor of political science, and a resident scholar in Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion. And then this shocked me, and I came to know afterwards that in May of 2025, you were appointed by the President of the United States to be a member of the Advisory Board of Legal Experts for the U.S. Religious Liberty Commission. So that is just incredible.
Yeah,
And of course, yeah, go
that's
ahead.
something that I actually just gave a talk the other night at Baylor for the Undergraduate Federalist Society on the question of what is the meaning of religious liberty. And I told the audience, which consisted mostly of students, that I'm as surprised as anyone that I'm on the advisory board of legal experts and honored to serve. I, was floored when I first received the phone call from the White House. It wasn't the president. It was, somebody in the Office of Domestic Policy, and they asked if I would be interested in serving. So I agreed to it, and just on September 29th, I testified before the commission, which has held all of its meetings so far in the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C.
Wow. Well, I mean, there's not many people better to have that position. I mean, your book, Defending Life, it's a unique pro-life book, and to me, in that, you build the case for pro-life without grounding your arguments in religion, even though you are a Christian, but you don't use that as your grounding. And I've seen the reviews; it has resonated with so many people. They all say, a lot of them are like, "This is refreshing. Like it's a purely philosophical approach to pro-life." So it's a great resource for our listeners, whether you're Christian or an open skeptic willing to hear the pro-life case. And you're working on the second edition, which we will get
That
to. Yeah, we will touch on that towards the end. And I want to hear about what's changed and what's going on because.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. So I've actually turned in the manuscript to the publisher. Let's see about. Yeah. So there's going to be a new cover. So for the revised edition, I know we're going to talk about it later, but I just submitted the manuscript. I think the end of July, beginning of August, and it is considerably larger. There's just, and we'll talk about that later, but they're just things that have changed politically. Obviously, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but also I think there's a generally different sense of our political divisions than there were back in 2007.
Absolutely. Well, we were just talking about Gary Habermas's 3-volume set. You guys can see behind me that second row. Is it anything of that size? Because that is a paperweight.
No, it's 100. When I turned it in, it was 165,000 words.
Okay.
So it's I think the original edition, the first edition was maybe 110,000 words. So it's about 50% larger. I think I've learned a lot. And again, we'll have some time to talk about it. There's things that I think I can say better than I did in Defending Life. And so I just turned that in, and it'll probably be coming out at the end of 2026.
Perfect. Well, I will be one to pre-order that for sure, because this is a fantastic work. And yeah, we'll get to what's changed specifically. But I would love to just jump into the questions because I have so much for you today. And I kind of want to follow through the progression that you took in this first edition. And you start with the legality of abortion. And you touch on Roe v. Wade and other court cases that are important. But when I was reading this chapter, what came to mind was the popular objection of the separation of church and state, right? Anytime a Christian tries to go into the abortion debate and even mentions their faith, the first thing that we hear is, you're violating the separation of church and state. You can't do that. So I want to ask you, is that true? And what is the separation of church and state?
Yeah, so the phrase, the separation of church and state, actually, in terms of American history, it actually predates the founding of the United States. There were writers that used, like, not really the wall metaphor. I sort of there was a separationist language, but Thomas Jefferson, in his letter to the Danbury Baptist, used the wall of separation of church and state, and it was actually it was a letter that was in response to an inquiry made by the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, that objected to their state's taxing scheme, where if you were taxed, there was a portion of the property tax that was allotted to funding of ministers. And so Jefferson, and they objected to it, and because the way in which at least in the early 19th century, things were structured, it really wasn't a federal issue. It was a local issue. States were allowed to have quasi-established churches, even though citizens had robust religious liberty. If a state thought that supporting one church over another advanced the common good, as long as people were still free to join whatever church they wanted, that was considered to be largely permissible. Jefferson himself objected to those arrangements, but the federal government didn't prohibit it. So he writes this, and he talks about the wall of separation of church and state in his letter. It has over time become a kind of shorthand way to describe the relationship between religion and politics. I don't think it's really very informative. I mean, in terms of the Christian tradition, there has always been an understanding that church and state are different domains, that there are they have different jurisdictions. What that means in terms of practical law is another question altogether. So there are some members of the Supreme Court who have thought of separation of church and state to mean a kind of almost absolute separation, that religion is to have no influence on culture or society. That's a kind of extreme position. And then there are those who say, well, as long as the government doesn't endorse religion, and others who say, well, as long as there's no coercion. So there's like different gradations of what that means. But in terms of the abortion debate, the argument that actually had lost a lot of its resonance up until recently, after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there have been a number of law review articles in which academics have argued that any pro-life law violates the separation of church and state, because they argue that the view of human nature assumed in these laws is a quote-unquote Christian view or religious view. Now, that's not entirely false on one level, right? I mean, that in fact, there is an understanding of the development of human beings that seems to be consistent with, and at least implicitly taught in Scripture, about unborn human life. But having said that, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be, or there isn't, a philosophical defense that stands on its own. And that really is what matters. I mean, think, for example, of a politician who may support a charitable program, and the politician says, well, I'm supporting this form of welfare because Jesus tells us to support the poor. We wouldn't think, oh, well, that means that any welfare program that happens to support the poor is religious and therefore violates the separation of church and state. We would think, well, clearly this individual is motivated by his religion, but that doesn't mean there can't be good non-theological arguments that could resonate with people that aren't Christians or who don't share the politician's faith. And that's pretty much the argument that I make in the book, is that, yeah, surely there's no doubt that that if you look at the way in which the abortion debate is kind of cashed out in American politics, a vast majority of people who oppose abortion would qualify as Christian, if not generally religious. I mean, there are obviously non-Christian, let's say Jews and other Muslims who oppose abortion. And you would probably notice that a vast majority of people that support abortion rights are largely secular. But that doesn't mean that the arguments by themselves can't be defended from either side. So you find, ironically, people who call themselves pro-choice, who claim to be defending a Christian view of unborn life. In fact, the W.A. Criswell, the famous pastor of First Baptist Dallas, was pro-choice. I don't know if people know that. Criswell argued that human life did not become fully human until birth, when the fetus or the newborn child takes its first breath. And he argued that this was analogous to when God breathed into what became Adam. And I think it's a very bad argument theologically. Yeah. But yet Criswell would say that that was a Christian argument, right? Do pro-choice people then have to abandon their view because it happens to be consistent with W.A. Criswell's theological argument? No, not at all. So I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
So good. Yeah, it reminds me of James Tallarico, and he's a politician in Texas. I did a response to his take not too long ago where he went on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is like one of the biggest.
I saw that. He believes the Criswell argument. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. And I did a whole response to it because he brought up the first breath thing and the marry and consent and all these arguments that are just, you're basing your arguments in scripture. But a lot of those people, the pro-choicers, will say separation of church and state. So it's very selective, right? As you just displayed.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that is that a lot of times, and I think, those of us, anybody who takes the Bible seriously, can't just cite Bible verses. I think it was my friend Greg Kokel who has a little booklet called "Don't Just Quote the Bible" or "Just Don't Cite a Bible Verse," and his point is that, Scripture is embedded in a certain set of cultural assumptions. So, for instance, you'll often hear, abortion is never mentioned in the Bible. Well, that's true, but one reason why it's never mentioned, there's a couple of reasons why. One is that it's unthinkable. So it's the reason why it's not mentioned directly is it's outside of the framework of the people that composed it under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But you also have you have to realize that what abortion is and the types of procedures that are employed to perform them, that kind of medicine was not even thinkable at the time. So it's a combination of things like that. And so you have to look at these questions. So think about, as an example that I've used with my students, you'll often, people will say, well, Jesus never mentioned, X. And say, well, he didn't mention it because the issue that you're bringing up is something unique to the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, did Jesus address issues with principles that we can apply today to those questions, to these new questions? Of course. And there's also the sort of the paradox, right? That, Jesus never mentioned that the only issues we can address are the ones that Jesus mentioned, right? In any event.
Right.
Yeah,
silence does not equal permission, right? At the end of the day.
That's right.
And going back to the Thomas Jefferson letter, I've heard Dr. Frank Turek, Christian apologist, say it like this as well. Like, the separation of church and state was not to keep Christians out of the state, but to keep the state out of the church originally. And then it just unfolded in various ways, and now it's used as a popular argument. But to say that Christians can't use their faith or be influenced by their faith is kind of to imply that, like, atheism is true by default. Like, only atheists can do that.
It's a kind of anti-democratic argument.
Right.
It's a way to kind of get into the cognitive lives of citizens and say there are certain types of reasons that you cannot use. But we don't do that with other things, right? I mean, people sometimes vote for just bizarre reasons, right? They just may just, I like the politician's style. They don't care about the issues. I mean, are we going to say that those kind of reasons should be banned? People can't use those reasons. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go into voting, and I'm not, it's not clear that any of us, in fact, I'd say it is clear that none of us can defend every single one of our reasons, right? I mean, at some point you sort of have a set of beliefs that you hold, a kind of noetic structure, and you've done your best to think clearly about issues, and you go to the voting booth, right? And that's the best we can expect, right? There are only 24 hours in a day, 7 days a week, and you only live to maybe 80. And you can't study everything and evaluate everything. And everyone's like this, both Christians, non-Christians, religious people, non-religious people. That's just the nature of democracy and democratic participation. And so to sort of single out religious reasons as the reasons that don't belong is a kind of viewpoint discrimination. And now, does that mean, getting back to your initial inquiry about the separation of church and state and abortion, that doesn't mean, though, that pro-lifers don't have really good non-religious reasons. And I think they do. I think reasons that are consistent with the intuitions that most people have about the sanctity of human life and what we owe our neighbors.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think Christians ought to not be fazed by that objection. And I think it's important that Christians educate themselves on the separation of church and state, because too many times it gets brought up and it's just like submitted to, and then they go, oh, okay, fine. Like, I don't have to go down that route, but you should correct your neighbor on that, because it is a significant issue. But you mentioned Greg Koukl, your friend, and I know you wrote a book on relativism with him. He's been on this program once or twice before, and he's been like a remote mentor of mine. I think I have every book he's ever written, and I listen to his podcast all the time. So he has just really impacted my apologetics. But he said that and many other pro-lifers say this as well, that the most important question in the abortion debate is, what is the unborn? And he goes on to say this is because whether it is moral to kill something depends on what it is in the first place. If the unborn are not valuable human beings, no justification for abortion is necessary. However, if the unborn are human beings, then no explanation is adequate. And he proceeds to give an illustration of, like, if your daughter comes up behind you and says, Daddy, can I kill this? Your first question is going to be like, what is it? If it's a spider, go ahead. If it's a 2-year-old girl, no, absolutely not. So in part of that, I want to shift the conversation to that now. And I want to start with the science behind it, because the popular objection is, well, it's not, the unborn is not, it's not a human being scientifically. It's a clump of cells. It's a parasite. So what is your response to the scientific case for the unborn being human beings?
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot more about the science than people did even in the 19th century. In fact, it wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that we had any sort of understanding of how conception occurred in human beings. I mean, it's remarkable. And what we know is that at fertilization, you have the two germ cells, the sperm and the ovum, and there's a kind of intermingling where the ovum undergoes. In fact, here I'm going to use a little bit of philosophical language. There is what is called a substantial change. What is a substantial change? It's when the material of a thing continues to, in a sense, exist, but something else different arises. So think, for example, of an oak tree in your backyard, and you chop it down and you make a desk. All the same, you're using the parts of the oak tree, but the oak tree ceases to exist. Its matter is reconstituted to become the desk. The oak tree doesn't survive the change. The same thing with the ovum. Neither the ovum nor the sperm survive the change. But what arises for a short moment is the one-celled zygote, and in that zygote is the entirety of the DNA that eventually, what happens is zygote divides, and it divides very quickly, and over time those cells then develop into the organs and parts of a whole human being. And so you have from the very beginning a whole human being, and then the unfolding of that nature over time until, very soon, within the first 2 months of pregnancy, you have, if you can look at it, and we have the technology to observe its development, what amounts to, by the 7th week, is a small miniature human being. Obviously, it's a human being from the start, but it has the appearance of what we're accustomed to seeing in human beings, the arms, the head, the legs, and so forth. And from that point forward, from conception forward, all you have is sort of the unfolding of the very nature that's there from the beginning. And I think one of the difficulties that people have with understanding this kind of language is that we tend to have a kind of mechanistic view of nature. And so we tend to think of, and I think it's just reflexive, as human beings or any organism as sort of a collection of parts. So we always use these kind of machine analogies. We do this, by the way, with our brains, and we see this with AI, right? Oh, it's like our brains are like a computer. Well, yeah, that's not a bad analogy, but there's more to our minds than the simple computation, right? And the same thing is true of organisms. So if you think of an organism as a being with a particular nature that's ordered towards certain goods or ends, and that maturation isn't just the adding of parts, but the unfolding of what it already is. So this is why we think, for example, if we make a judgment about an organism like a human being, supposing I were to say that, Stevie Wonder is blind. Well, he's blind because he lacks sight, and human beings are beings that ought to have sight. But I don't say that about, let's say, my water bottle. I don't say my water bottle is blind or the rock is blind. Why? It doesn't see. Neither one sees, to be sure, but neither one is really blind because it doesn't lack sight. So this is why I think it makes sense to think of any sort of impairment that we would inflict on a developing fetus. Supposing, let's say, a mad scientist were to block the development of the brain so that the fetus is denied its higher brain functions, and so that its organs can be harvested by a group of mad scientists so they can sell them on the black market, or some kind of weird science fiction scenario like that. If, let's say, we discovered that a group of pro-life radicals were to break into that laboratory and rescue the fetuses and return them to health so that their brains can develop normally, I think the normal reaction would be, well, that's an act of justice. Why? Because the embryo is entitled to its higher brain functions, or the fetus is entitled to its higher brain functions. Well, if it's entitled to its higher brain functions, then it's entitled to all its functions, which would mean that abortion would be unjustified on the same grounds. So I think, to get back to the science, I think it's pretty clear that the science leads to the conclusion that unborn human life, individual unborn human life begins at conception.
That's a great way to say it. And the parts and wholes issue is really important as well. I'm glad you touched on that. And this is not new to pro-choice scholars like Peter Singer and David Boonin, who flat out admit that the unborn is indeed genetically, biologically a human being. There's no disagreement there. So the popular audience just needs to get with that line of thinking. But the difference is, and I think this is where we're going to shift to, is more philosophical, because, as you know, this is nothing new to you, but as David Boonin and Peter Singer will say, that it's a genetic completely human being scientifically, it's not really a human person until there's certain cognitive functions, until it looks a certain way, until it has certain abilities. So at the moment, the unborn is just a potential person, and that's where we get philosophical. So that's where the question becomes, what does it mean to be a human person? What's the requirements? And is there even any requirements that are necessary? So I'd love to shift the conversation from the science to the philosophy, which I know is your wheelhouse. So as before we get into those requirements, because I do want to emphasize those, you have a chapter in here that I haven't seen in a lot of other works that I thought was so powerful. And it's the popular arguments, such as the argument from pity, the argument from tolerance, and the ad hominem. Can you just unpack those three arguments and maybe give, if you can, like an example of each that you typically hear of or see?
Yeah. So you mentioned the argument from pity, the argument from tolerance, and what was the
From
other one you mentioned?
ad hominem.
Ad hominem. Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Yeah, because I know there's a bunch of them that
Yeah.
I have general. Those are the general categories. So yeah, so the ad hominem argument is something like this: you pro-lifers are inconsistent if you also support capital punishment. First off, that's not an attack upon the pro-life view of abortion. It's really an attack upon the character of the pro-lifer. So just assuming for the sake of argument that it is inconsistent to support, to oppose abortion and support capital punishment, because they both, that abortion and capital punishment both result in the death of a human being, that wouldn't mean that the pro-life view on abortion is wrong. It would just mean that that person lacks a consistent moral vision of the world. So what? That doesn't. I mean, it would be like if let's say, I discriminated against Asian people, but I treated my African American friends with dignity and respect, and somebody pointed out that inconsistency. I mean, that wouldn't mean that I should abandon treating my African American friends with dignity and respect. I mean, I could be consistent by treating everyone badly. Right? That's a weird kind of, I mean, that just, to me, it has nothing to do with, another one that usually men get this, well, you're a man, you can't get pregnant, therefore you shouldn't have an opinion on abortion. That has nothing to do with whether my arguments for it or for the pro-life view work. In fact, years ago, I was on a radio program when Defending Life had come out. I think it was a Iowa State University school. It was the university's radio station, and the host had invited I don't know if it was a professor or somebody that was running a local national organization for women's chapter, and she immediately went to, well, you're a man, you have no right to address the question of abortion. And I just simply asked, well, how do you know I'm a man? And she said, well, you have a deep voice. And I said, well, so does Brenda Vaccaro. Brenda Vaccaro was a famous actress. She's now since passed away. And so I said, and besides, my name is Frances. And, that's a girl's name. And so, she was really frustrated. She says, well, you're a man. and I said, well, what if I weren't? I said, okay, I concede, I am a man, but what if you came across my book in a used bookstore or online, and you didn't know from my name Francis that I was a man or a woman? How would you evaluate the quality of the arguments in the book? I mean, would you just simply want to figure out what my sex was? I said, that's a weird way to evaluate someone's position. It doesn't. In fact, it's kind of sexist, right? And so, yeah, that's the ad hominem. The argument from pity. There's different variations on this. It appeals to the fact that there are going to be difficult situations in a person's life in which abortion would seem to them to be a good solution. So think, for example, of a woman who is, let's say, has an alcoholic husband, has 5 or 6 children already, She lives in abject poverty. That's a kind of situation where you're drawn to her plight, and rightfully so. You're emotionally moved by it. And, someone could say, well, in that situation, I think abortion is justified because you're going to relieve that family of that burden, and that child's not going to grow up in poverty. But the problem with that is that why couldn't we apply that same reasoning to the children that already are born? That is, what if, we were to tell her, well, look, your 3-year-old, supposing the 3-year-old was a child that was disabled and required more expenses to take care of the child, what would we say to somebody who told her, well, we can put that child to sleep, and that would relieve you of a burden? We would say, well, that's monstrous to consider killing a disabled child because they're disabled and they cost a lot of money. But the comeback is, well, but that's different. Well, how is it different? Well, the typical response, well, but that child, the 3-year-old, is, born already. Oh, so the issue is not whether the child's existence is a burden. The question is whether it is a full-fledged member of the human community. And so that ultimately is the more important question to answer the question of whether terminating the pregnancy or aborting the child is justified. So in other words, what's going on is that the person that uses that argument is begging the question. They're assuming that the unborn child is not a person, because that's why it works, right? I mean, if you switch it to the 3-year-old that's disabled, well, then people recognize immediately, well, this is a horrible thing. You can't just be killing innocent children because they can relieve the family of a burden. Well, then the question is, are the unborn children? That's really the question. You have to answer that first. And then you mentioned the tolerance argument. Again, this begs the question as well. So you hear some of this today. We were talking earlier about the separation of church and state argument. So sometimes the people who use that argument will use something like this. They'll say that the pro-life position is intolerant of points of view that disagree with it, insofar as it's sort of forcing other people to have to accept it. But that sort of bypasses actually addressing the question of the unborn's full humanity. Because we can apply that argument to all sorts of other issues, right? I mean, aren't laws that prohibit spousal abuse forcing on people a particular understanding of how spouses should treat each other? How about laws that forbid racial discrimination or slavery? Aren't those laws kind of forcing on people a kind of overall, vision of what the good life is? So I don't think you can escape that. In addition to that, one could, from a pro-life perspective, argue that the pro-abortion view is forcing on unborn children a particular vision of the good life that doesn't allow them to develop in a way so that they can or they can act and conduct their lives as fully dignified human persons. So I think, again, these kind of popular arguments all kind of smuggle in the assumption that unborn human beings are not full-fledged members of the human community, which means that that's the question that's more important to answer, rather than these other sorts of arguments that clearly have emotional resonance with people, but all in one way or another beg the question.
Absolutely. And I love it because I post clips of these interviews that we do on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and the two topics that I get the most pushback, it goes on the atheist and the pro-choicers, is evolution and abortion. And it's like hundreds of comments, and they're all based on these popular arguments. So when I read this chapter, I was just like, yes, this is what I need to read. And as you were talking, like the ad hominem one, I just think of arguments don't have gender. So even if I'm a man, like you're a man, and arguments don't have gender. And then the tolerance, as I was reading that chapter, I just thought, the one, and you mentioned this in the book as well, but the one that I just can't stand and I have to address when it comes up is, you can't force your morality on me. And it's like, well, you're forcing your morality on me by telling me I can't do that. You're saying can't, right? So and that goes to the relativism issue at large.
what's assumed too in that kind of quip is that morality is person relative, which there's a sense in which, I mean, we do live in a free society, right? So we do have something like religious freedom. So there's an element of truth to that quip, but it seems to cut short. Well, not does it seem, it actually cut short a conversation about whether the unborn is in fact one of us and ought to be treated with the kind of respect that all persons ought to be treated. So it's a way, it's one of these kind of argument stoppers, right? It's a way to, and I don't think that everyone who uses it, is actually consciously thinking that, but I do think it's a way that people just have habituated, or they've been habituated to sort of using this kind of language, and it's a way to not advance conversation, but to end it.
Yes, 100%. And you mentioned how, they assume that it assumes that the unborn are not equally human being as you and I. And that's where I want to go to next, because, all these questions come up in the abortion debate, all these objections, but what really matters at the core of it is, what is the unborn, right? So before we get to, as I mentioned before, the pro-choicers will say the unborn has to have X, Y, and Z. We'll go into the X, Y, and Z. But before we do that, would you mind just giving, what is the substance view, the view that the pro-lifers typically hold? What is the substance view of humanity, and what are some good reasons to believe that that's true?
Yeah, so the substance view is the view that that the word substance, which I think I alluded to earlier when I was talking about substantial change, it's the view that we are beings of a particular sort, and that as beings of a particular sort, we have a particular nature, and that nature gets manifested with different types of activities and powers. So human beings are of the nature, and here I'm going to use the language of Aristotle. We are rational animals by nature. That means that we have certain powers and ways of acting that are perfections of our nature. What I mean by perfection is not that we can become perfect, but that when we mature, ordinarily, not obviously there are people that are disabled and these powers are sometimes impeded because of health reasons or congenital disabilities, but we are ordered towards these particular ends, and we don't cease to be a rational animal when we're either immature or when we lose those abilities for a variety of reasons, right? We could be ill, we can be at the end of life, we can suffer from Alzheimer's or other ailments, we can be in comas, but we're still rational animals. We still have that intrinsic dignity as beings of that sort. And I think the reason why it makes sense as a view is that first off, it's a view that ultimately grounds our equality the best. So the idea that human beings are equal, that we should be treated with equal dignity and respect, something that I think is a logical extension of the doctrine of the Imago Dei, that we're made in the image of God. But it's also something that's been recognized by secular thinkers from the Enlightenment, thinkers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant and others. And the problem of trying to ground equality in those characteristics that philosophers like Peter Singer, David Boonin, Michael Tooley, Marianne Warren articulate is that those attributes come in degrees. So think, for example, something like having a self-concept or having a life plan or engaging in rational thought. We all are on a spectrum in that regard. Right? So none of us really has it quite the same. And yet these thinkers want to argue that human beings are in a sense equal. And I don't think, and by the way, a lot of these, Jeff McMahon, in an article that was published, I think about 15 years ago in the Journal of, I think it was the Journal of Ethics. I could be mistaken about that. Points out that this is something that he finds to be very difficult with the position that he defends. He's on the side with those thinkers that I'd already mentioned. So I think that the view helps us make sense of why we should, for example, treat people that are cognitively disabled with dignity and respect. It makes sense of the view of equality. It also explains why it would be wrong to intentionally create brainless children so that we can harvest their organs, even before their brains fully develop. So in the book, in Defending Life, I give, and you've read it, I give a whole variety of sort of counterexamples to show that the substance view makes the best sense of all these intuitions that we have about why it would be wrong to, do all these sorts of things to human beings who either presently lack or have lost the ability to exercise those powers that we typically attribute to rational animals.
Yep, and we are going to get to that for sure because I loved how you handled those. But yeah, the substance view I think makes the most sense. When you think of human equality, especially, and in response, a pro-choice philosopher, Judith Jarvis Thompson, I think she's passed now, but she
Yes.
said, yeah, as an objection, she said similar things might be said about the development of an acorn into an oak tree, and does not follow that acorns are oak trees or that we had better say they are. And then Greg, our friend, mutual friend, I guess, he wisely responds. He says, the confusion can be cleared up by asking a simple question. What kind of seed is an acorn? There's only one answer, an oak. Ask the same question at every stage of growth, seed, sprout, and sapling or tree, and the answer is always the same. So right on to what you're saying, the substance doesn't change, just the stage of development. So yeah, do you want to comment
Yeah.
on that at
So
all?
yeah, it's almost like somebody saying, "Well, an infant isn't an octogenarian." Well, okay, yeah, but that doesn't mean they're not the same thing.
Right.
That's the issue, is whether it's the same thing. And the other thing to ask is, why do we value oak trees? What's our relationship to oak trees in comparison to fellow human beings? So we may look at an oak tree and say it's majestic, it's beautiful, it could be used to build a desk or a home. There's all sorts of things that we think about oak trees, but when we think of fellow human beings, we don't think of them as, oh, well, we shouldn't kill Bob because he's beautiful. Right? I mean, that's not that we think there's something else going on in our moral judgments about how we should treat human beings that differ from the way we think about oak trees or acorns or saplings. And those, yes, so a sapling's not an oak tree in the sense that it's not a mature version of itself, but that's the same thing about human beings. Yeah, so Thompson says that, interestingly, in an article where she writes the article, came out in 1971, called The Defense of Abortion, and she publishes her article before the whole personhood human being distinction becomes popular among philosophers. So she's not been briefed yet of what's going to be in the future, which is only a couple months later, I think, or maybe 6 or 8 months later. Michael Tooley publishes his famous article where he makes that distinction. But when Thompson writes that article, she actually doesn't make that distinction between human being and person. And she is kind of saying that, the early embryo isn't even yet a human being. And later on, and she actually says, well, I'm going to concede for the sake of argument that the unborn is a human being or a person, and still argue that abortion is justified. And she's got a whole different set of arguments compared to some of the folks that we're talking about now.
Yes, and I have that listed in my list of questions, but I do not think we're going to get
We
to
don't have the
that
time.
giant. So if you're interested and you want to come back on, which I would love to have you back on, we can have a whole separate episode on that topic, because that is really important. That really, it boils down to that bodily autonomy argument, right? That's what it comes down to. But before we get there, I want to tackle some of the requirements that you listed and went through in the book that the pro-choice advocate will say the unborn is not a human person until fill in the blank. And I kind of want to do somewhat of a rapid fire segment here, if you're comfortable with that, where I'll just list them off one by one, and you could be as rapid as you want. Could be a one-liner, could be a couple paragraphs, whatever you want. But I'll just throw them at you and we'll see what comes about. So the first one is birth, right? The pro-choicer says, Dr. Beckwith, I don't believe the unborn is a human person until birth. How do you respond?
Yeah, so birth is something that happens to a being that already exists. So it's like if I went from New Jersey to Manhattan in the Lincoln Tunnel, that wouldn't change who I was. Right? Passing through the birth canal is no different than passing through the Lincoln Tunnel.
That was really well said. That was really good. The second one is brain activity. Dr. Beckwith, I don't believe the unborn is a person until they have some brain activity. I mean, they have no brain activity. So how are they a person?
Yeah, so prior to the detection of brain activity, what the brain is not necessary. So right now for us, I mean, we think of like brain death, right? So what the brain does, it fully integrates the organism, right? And so when there's brain death, the organism is no longer an organism. It's just a heap, right? It's just a collection of parts. It's not an integrated whole. But prior to the arising of brain waves, which is, there's a dispute about when exactly it can be detected. It's usually, some scholars have argued, 6 to 7 weeks. So prior to that, there is no identifiable brain, but that doesn't mean that it is not a fully integrated organism of the human species that is of the nature rational animal.
So good. Yep, that's right on. And then the third one is sentience. Dr. Beckwith, I don't see how a human person deserving of moral rights can have those rights until they feel pain or experience pleasure.
Yeah, well, in that case, we could just let's say if we wanted to kill somebody, just like inject them with whatever medicine would, result in them not being able to experience pain or pleasure, or somebody who's in a temporary coma, right? I mean, that seems the sentience criterion, I don't think seems to work for that reason, that there's nothing especially, imagine there were human beings, and I'm sure there are people that have had some kind of brain, they may have been brain injury where they can't feel pleasure or pain. That doesn't mean we can kill them.
Right. Right. And the last one is, it's really important because, it was the center of Roe v. Wade. You already know where I'm going just by that. And also recently, I don't know if you've seen this or what you think about it, but someone who I've looked up to as far as apologetics goes, N.T. Wright, has recently come on an interview and was talking about abortion and was saying that abortion is permissible in some cases, and said in the case of like rape and incest, but didn't specifically limit it to just those cases, and grounded it in the argument of viability, which really came to a shock to me. But what would you say to a person who says the unborn are not persons until they're viable, they can live on their own?
Yeah, so again, like the birth criterion, viability is not a measure of the nature of the being. It's just the measure of the dependency, right? So with the birth criterion, you're sort of passing through the birth canal. Viability simply means that you are no longer dependent upon your mother. The weird thing about that argument for me is that it's weird for a Christian theologian to say that the time at which one is most justified in killing a fellow human being is when they're most dependent. I mean, that just seems to be just the opposite of what we learn from Scripture, right? What we learn from Scripture is that when we recognize somebody's dependency, that is when we should be most moved to help them. Think, for example, of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Imagine, the two priests that walked by were asked later, they were, let's say, interviewed by the local, media in the Middle East, and they said, why did you pass by the guy that was, had been assaulted and robbed on the side of the road? Well, he was most dependent. That's precisely why the Samaritan is good, because he recognizes the dependency. So, I have great respect for N.T. Wright, but I just think that's kind of an odd argument for, a theologian and a biblical scholar of his renowned to make. And again, that's not his area of expertise either. So I'm not sure I don't want to speak for him, but I'll just leave it at that.
It was, no, I agree. The speechlessness was on my end as well when I heard it. And I mean, it's in my paper because I feel like I had to put it in there. And it's just, it's a misconception. And I feel like viability is more subject to the advancement of technology than anything else. There's some places in the world where viability is 30 weeks and then some it's 22 weeks. And you're not alive in one and then not alive in the other country.
But by the way, the viability criterion, you mentioned Roe v. Wade, that was used by the court not as a criterion to determine whether the fetus is a person under the law, but when the state has an interest in prenatal life. So technically, the Supreme Court wasn't saying the states must protect unborn life after viability. All that the court said was that the states may protect life after viability. And the viability criterion was not in any of the briefs of any of the parties in Roe v. Wade. It was literally the result of one of Blackmun's clerks had seen that it had been used in a case in Connecticut. I'm just relying here on memory. And so the parties in the case were just as surprised as anybody else to see the viability criterion being used by Blackmun in the court's opinion.
Wow. Yeah.
By the way, in the first edition, I don't mention that, but in the revised edition, I do. Since the revised edition, when the first edition came out, a new book has been published by Clark Forsythe, an attorney for Americans United for Life, about the history of Roe v. Wade, and it's really informative. And so one of the things that Clark, who's a good friend, discovered in his research was all these he got to access to the papers of Justice Blackmun, and he got to see what was going on behind the scenes, and that was something that comes out in Clark's book.
That's so good. Well, now that you're on the topic, what else has changed with the second edition? What compelled you to write it? And tell us more about it. Just
so the couple of things. I mean, really, the main thing was the change of the Supreme Court. So the overturning of Roe v. Wade. As you mentioned at the beginning, I have a chapter on Roe v. Wade in the first edition. So the new edition has the chapter on Roe v. Wade has been significantly revised. A lot of what Clark Forsythe had in his book really helped me to reevaluate how I presented things. Also, a book that had come out by Carter Snead at Notre Dame called What Does It Mean to Be Human? It was published 5 years ago at Harvard University Press, and Carter is a pro-life champion on the law faculty at Notre Dame, and his book has a lot of kind of the legal background that I didn't put in the first edition about the history of Roe v. Wade. Then I have a whole new chapter on the Dobbs case, and there I go through the majority opinion, the two concurring opinions by Thomas and Kavanaugh, the opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, where he agrees with who should win the case but doesn't agree with overturning Roe v. Wade, and then the three dissenters. So, and then I also deal with in that chapter two new attempts to defend the right to abortion through the Constitution. One is a religious liberty argument for the right to abortion, and the other is a argument based on the 13th Amendment, arguing that the ban on involuntary servitude that was passed after the Civil War, that laws that ban abortion essentially have the state asking the pregnant woman to engage in involuntary servitude. I think both arguments are flawed, and so now the 13th Amendment argument is actually not that popular, but it's been defended by a friend of mine at Northwestern University, Andrew Koppelman, and there was a federal district or maybe a state district court in Texas that cites Andrew's argument. So I thought, I should get ahead of this and deal with it in the book. And now the rest of the book, the popular argument chapter has some significant revisions. I just wanted to sort of tinker with things, and then the chapter on the nature of unborn life in terms of the science. I wanted to deal with some recent challenges to the kinds of arguments I made in that chapter, and there I relied heavily on the work of Maureen Kondik. Biology. She'd been a biology professor for many years at the University of Utah, and she's now at Catholic University of America. And I actually had her read through my chapter, and she was a wonderful person to read through it, because she said, I think your chapter is fine as it is, but if the biologists look at it, they're going to pick on you, so I'm going to make sure that you say everything just the right way. So I'm so relieved that Maureen gave me some really nice feedback, because I'm not a scientist. I'm just a philosopher with a law degree. So I'm not, so that was nice to have that. And then the chapters on Thompson's argument, the Thompson argument chapter has been significantly revised. It's about 70% changed. That has a lot to do with recent work that I've done on Thompson's argument since the publication of Defending Life. And then the chapter on personhood, I think that chapter, the arguments are largely the same, but I was able to go through and I think make them leaner and meaner in the sense that as rereading the first edition, now as a reader you may have a different view on this, but as the author, I thought that I could have been clearer in places and more dealing with different variations on the arguments that I originally made. And plus there have been people responding to the first edition, so I wanted to deal with them. One of the critics is Kate Greasley, who came out with a book, I think in 2015 or 18, defending the right to abortion, and she is critical of my work, so I wanted to deal with her. Yeah, so I think I think the book is, I think there's greater clarity in it. I think I've learned also how to say things better. Again, as a reader, you may think, I think the first edition was fine, but as an author, you tend to be a little bit more self-critical. So those are the changes from the first edition. I did remove one chapter in the first edition. I have a chapter on embryonic stem cell research and cloning, which I removed because those really aren't issues anymore as they were when the book was published.
So good. And I do think everything was clear. I will say that. But two, I understand, just me writing, it's nothing like a book, but me writing the thesis alone, I reread chapters and I'm thinking, oh man, I can, because I'm still in the process of revising, but I got to do better at clearing this up and making it as clear as possible for the reader. But yeah, I'm really excited, and I would love to have you back on, if that's something we could coordinate, to talk about the Thompson argument, because it's so key and it's brought up so much in the comments, and it's that mic drop moment that pro-choicers think they have. And I think it's extremely flawed, and the way you handled it in here was really good. I'm really excited to hear about and read about how you handled it in the second edition. So maybe when it comes out, we could have you back on, and that way we could just promote it directly. When is the release date again? You said 2026? Probably
not to the end of next year.
End of next year. So hopefully have you on before that.
Yeah. So I've sent the manuscript to the publisher, and I've not heard back. I only heard back that they've received it. And so I think that they're sending it out for people to look at. And so I'll probably get some feedback from some of the people that had read the first edition and made suggestions, and I tried to address some of those. But so right now the timeline, I think, will put me at the end of 2026.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I will be hopefully one of the first to pre-order it, because I'm very excited. And this book has made such a tremendous impact. And again, for our listeners, I can't recommend it enough. You could wait for edition 2, or you could read this one real quick and get the double of it, because every Christian should read this, because you should be prepared to go into the arena, so to speak, with arguments to defend life, both from a religious standpoint, from our faith. But there's, as Dr. Beckwith, you mentioned throughout this episode, there's significant secular philosophical reasons for why the pro-life view is correct, and you should be equipped to do both. And for the skeptic, we have some skeptics that listen in and take a look at it. If you're open and you're willing to read the pro-life case, Dr. Beckwith, I think you do a fantastic job of presenting the pro-choice case objectively, not in any biased way, which I think is respectable. So I can't recommend it enough. But Dr. Beckwith, thank you so much for joining today. This has been something I've been looking forward to, and it's been extremely insightful for me. So really, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Good visiting with you.
Yes. Well, and to our listeners, thank you guys for tuning in, and God bless.